In today's episode, we're going to talk about how to buy a tenant-occupied property. And believe me, you better know how to buy one, because if you buy one wrong, you could be in big trouble. So stay tuned. We're going to keep you out of trouble and in the black. Today we're discussing tenant-occupied properties. So we're going to discuss what is a tenant-occupied property, why is it important to have documentation when you're buying a tenant-occupied property, what is an estoppel letter or an estoppel certificate and how can you use it to help you, and then last we're going to talk about the 4 major mistakes that investors make when they're buying a tenant-occupied property. And this is very important because it'll keep you out of hot water, so stay tuned. So what is a tenant-occupied property? It sounds kind of obvious at first, right? Of course, it's a property you buy that has someone inside of it paying rent or leasing the property. Yeah, well, that's real obvious, and I get it. It is obvious. But what if you're buying a property and there's an undivided interest and you don't really see the occupant, but there's occupants in there with you, in the deal with you? What if you buy a piece of land and you go on it and there's nothing on the land and there's no house, so there's no tenant occupying it per se, but then you find out 2 weeks later as you're clearing the land to make parcels to subdivide so you can build houses, you find out that there's a lease for a rancher to graze his cattle on that land for the next 7 years. So it's not so obvious sometimes, and that's why I wanted to have this formal conversation about what is a tenant-occupied property, because there's more to look for than just a person in an apartment or a person in a house. And why do we need documents from the people in the property? Let's say you got a $200,000 house and you're going to buy it for $10,000. Do you really need documentation concerning the person that's in the house? You say to yourself, man, it's a $200,000 house. I'm going to get it for $10,000. Well, who cares what that guy's problem is? Whatever it is, I'll handle it. Well, what if that guy says, I paid rent to this man for 12 years, and he said if I paid him for 12 years, I would be the owner, and I have a lawsuit against you now because you don't own this property, I own this property. That's a problem, isn't it? So, I say never buy a property if you don't have original documentation as to how the occupant inside that property is there. Are they there because they're a renter? Were they there as an owner finance buyer who's in default? Are they there as a squatter? How are they in there? Because if you don't have documentation as to how that person's in that house, there are some people out there that I like to affectionately call sidewalk lawyers. They're people that are professionals at moving into houses and stating a fabricated argument that they have rights to that house that they don't have, and it can take you a very long time to get them out, and it can be very expensive to win the lawsuit if you have to lawyer up. So I really do not like to buy properties where I do not have original documentation as to why these people are occupying the property or the improvements. Okay? Now, when you do find a property that you want to buy that has an occupant and you do get the documentation, you need to read through it carefully. You need to read through it to make sure that you agree, because if you buy that property and there is a lease on that property signed by the current owner and the current occupant, when you buy this property, you will have to honor that document 100%. So another reason why you need that documentation is you need to see what it says. Does it say that this is a life estate and that this person can live there for $10 a month until they die? Because if they can, then you probably don't want to buy this property. Or if you do still want to buy it, you need to know what you're up against, right? Maybe it says that this person has the right to rent this property for only $50 a month for the next 10 years. Well, you probably don't want to pay $200,000 for a house that you can only collect $50 a month from for the next 10 years. These are exaggerated cases, but you get my point. You need to see what the documentation says, because if you buy that house, you're going to have to live with these agreements if they're legitimate, okay? And you need to know what they say. So I hope I've impressed upon you the importance of getting your hands on the original documents. If your seller doesn't have an agreement with the person in the house, then I suggest strongly that you don't buy the house until your seller gets an agreement signed with your buyer. And that agreement can look very much like what you want it to look like. But I wouldn't buy the house until I've talked to that occupant and we've come to some kind of written agreement about where they stand, how they're in there, and when they're going to leave. It'll save yourself a lot of heartache, because once you buy the house, you've lost all your leverage to get the seller to help negotiate with the undocumented occupant anything. You've lost all your leverage. And the occupant, if they're a sidewalk lawyer, will know that too. And you'll be asking for big trouble. They'll dig in. Ask me how I know all this stuff. I know all this stuff because it's happened to me more than once. It shouldn't have happened to me more than once, but I'm a slow study. That's why I'm talking to you. I'm trying to help you avoid these problems. Now, before I talk about the 4 critical mistakes that most investors make when they buy an owner-occupied property, I want to implore you to take a good hard look at that like button and that share button, and please, let's use them. Walk your little fingers right over there. Let's hit that like button and hit that share button. Let the world know that we exist, because a lot of people don't. And also, if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, because I can help you in so many different areas, not because I'm the smartest guy in the world, but because I've had a long, very busy career, and I've had a lot of things happen to me, good and bad. And I think I can help you avoid some of the bad stuff, and I think I can push you quicker to the good stuff. So hit that subscribe button. As promised, let's talk about the 4 critical mistakes that real estate investors make when they buy a tenant-occupied property. Now, as you can guess, the number 1 mistake is they don't get and review the documents as to how that occupant is in that property. That's the number 1 mistake, is they don't get copies of the documents, they don't get original documents, and they don't review the documents, and they don't understand really how that person is in there. This is very dangerous. So make sure you get documents and that you understand the documents, because you're going to have to honor them if you buy the property. If there's no documents, you better get some documents before you buy the property. Number 2, a lot of times you'll buy a tenant-occupied property and there is a lease, but the lease has expired, so it's kind of rolled over into a month-to-month agreement. You know, when a year lease expires, but the person in the house doesn't leave the house, it just uses the same terms of the year lease, but it's every 30 days. If they had to pay every 2 weeks, then it's every 2 weeks you have a chance to renegotiate. If they were paying every 30 days, then every 30 days you have a chance to renegotiate. And I strongly suggest that if you buy a tenant-occupied property and they're on a month-to-month kind of lease now, that the first opportunity, at the first month that expires, you sit down with them and you rewrite the entire agreement for your occupant in your contract, in your words, with your lawyer's approval, with everything. It's very hard to function with other people's contracts. Other people's contracts usually have huge holes in them and are usually not as good as your contracts. So I would always renegotiate to my contract at the first possible opportunity. And here's an example of why you would want to do that. Recently, my partner and I bought a package of 5 car sales lots. You know, those little mom and pop car lots that you see up and down the street. We bought a package of 5 of them. And it took a long time to close this deal. And when it closed, we celebrated, and then we woke up the next morning and we went on with life as usual. And we missed the opportunity to renegotiate every lease with every renter that we had. And when the freezes came to Texas, some pipes broke in the ceiling of one of the car lots. The water pipes had been run through the ceiling, and when they broke in the ceiling, and they poured down onto the desk and ruined a whole bunch of computers that my tenant had. I thought, no problem. All my tenants are responsible for their own stuff, and they have been informed that they have to have renter's insurance, or they sign off that they don't have renter's insurance, but that I'm not responsible for it. Of course, I don't need to worry about that. But I forgot to have them sign my lease. I was operating on the lease from the seller. The seller who sold me the property had a lease with them, and come to find out, his lease wasn't very good, and I was going to have to pay for all that computer stuff. About $5,000 worth. So, This is how you learn your lessons in this business, or at least how I learn them. Hopefully you can learn this lesson ahead of time. The minute you have a chance to renegotiate the lease, you get the lease into your framework, into your words from your lawyer, and do not operate on your seller's lease. Cut that as short as you can. Number 3 mistake is the buyer of a tenant-occupied property does not collect the rent deposits from the seller. They close, they fund, the seller moves off to Tahiti, and then later on, your tenant wants to move out and he wants his deposit back, and you're going, well, I didn't get a deposit. And they said, well, I gave the deposit to the guy that moved me in here, the guy who sold you the property. And you say, well, he didn't give it to me. And they say, well, I really don't care. I want my deposit back. Remember, you bought that property and you have to honor the lease that came with that property. And if you didn't collect the deposit from the seller, then you got to take the deposit out of your pocket and give it back to this guy, or state all the reasons why he doesn't deserve a deposit. But anyway, it's your problem. So make sure you get the deposits when you buy a tenant-occupied property. The 4th and final mistake that investors make when they buy a tenant-owned property is they don't get estoppel certificates or estoppel letters. What is an estoppel certificate? An estoppel letter is basically a set of statements, probably written by the seller, that describes the status of the account of the occupant. That they owe so much per month, that their lease was originated on a certain day, that the lease is over on a certain day, that the tenant is current, or that they're late, and this is the balance that they owe in rent, and this is the late fees, and this is their standing as of right now. When this property transfers from the seller to you, the buyer, you have estoppel certificates on every tenant that is occupying the property. And it's only signed typically by the tenant. So your owner would go to the tenant and say, I put your status right here on this piece of paper. Do you agree that it's true? If the tenant says, yes, this is true, the tenant will sign so that you will know the status of that tenant. If that tenant's 3 months behind and you buy this property, they were 3 months behind with your seller, but now they're 3 months behind with you because they signed this estoppel certificate, right? And everyone is in agreement of where everyone is. And that's the importance of estoppel certificates, is to let you know the status of every tenant in the property, and it is signed by every tenant so that the tenant can't change his mind or say that that's not true. As always, when we're talking about legal documents or legal matters or stating any kind of legalese, I highly advise that you get your own legal representation to represent you and to review everything that's said here. These are my opinions and things that I've done for better or for worse. But I'm not a licensed attorney. I'm not a licensed CPA. And you need to put this stuff in front of your legal counsel, okay, and your financial advisors. Make sure they're right for you. Make sure they're right for the state that you're in and deals with your ordinances and your guidelines in your state. So please always do that. So today's giveaway, I would like to give you a copy of an estoppel letter or an estoppel certificate. That way you have one in your hand, you know what it looks like. I'm sure they vary from place to place or attorney to attorney, but they're pretty basic and you can add or subtract from them as you want. So go to 1000houses.com/estoppel. That's ESTOPPEL. Estoppel. 1000houses.com/estoppel, and you'll be downloaded a digital copy right there, and you'll get to see it and have it. Check it out with your lawyer first. Make sure it's everything you want it to be, and then feel free to use it. This is Mitch Stephen. I've enjoyed this thoroughly. I will see you in the next episode. Follow me.